We start off with just the logic of a hypothesis test. And I start off with a sentence that's already filled in for your notes here, that the logic of a hypothesis test is just like how we do things here judicially in the United States, which is that you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. If you are accused of a crime, we always assume you are innocent. It is on the prosecutor to then prove that that is wrong. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to assume the null hypothesis is true until the data says otherwise, just like we assume that someone is innocent until the data, the evidence, demonstrates otherwise. And now, an important distinction is that because we assume that the null is true from the start, you can never prove it true. And this is just like in a courtroom. Because we assume someone is innocent, we never come back and say that we conclude someone's innocent. We conclude that they're either guilty or not guilty. We'll come back to that later, but we can never prove someone's innocence because we started off with the assumption that someone's innocent. And that should also make sense because if you think about it, if you're on a jury, you cannot know 100% that someone is innocent. And why is that? Because the only way that you would know 100% if that person was innocent was if you were involved with that person, you were, with that person at the time of the said crime or something of that nature, or you committed the crime yourself, whatever it may be, right? And in all of those scenarios, you would not be in the jury box. You would likely be a witness or on trial yourself as well. So we never can prove someone's innocence. We always just assume it to start with. We can never prove the null hypothesis to be true because we assume it to be true from the start. What we do instead is we either reject or fail to reject that underlying assumption, just like we reject or fail to reject someone's innocence. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to reject or fail to reject the null. And so I've summarized that in our next bullet point, that we do not use the terminology of accepting the null hypothesis. Highlight that we do not ever say that we accept the null hypothesis. That is incorrect terminology. And the term accept implies something stronger than what we were able to do. Rather, what we do is we fail to reject, because that is more accurate with regards to the idea that we're saying the available evidence isn't strong enough to warrant rejection. If we think back to the court case, most of the time, the way the system is designed to work, of course, is that if someone is on trial, there is some evidence against that person. For instance, a grand jury would never indict if there wasn't some sort of evidence. So by the time it gets to a jury trial, there is some evidence clearly that the person has committed the crime. It may not be a lot, it may be a little bit, maybe a lot, who knows, right? But there's something there. And when someone is ruled not guilty by a jury, that doesn't necessarily, again, mean that they think that person's innocent. What they're saying is there was some evidence that it was that person, sure, but it wasn't enough to overcome this burden of proof that the prosecutor has. Right? It was saying, sure, I see what you're getting at, but I didn't have enough evidence. It wasn't strong enough for me to come back and say, yes, that innocence that we started off with assuming, I'm going to reject that. And that's what happens here, is that we are either going to say there is enough evidence, we're going to reject the null, we're going to reject that innocence because we just have overwhelming evidence, or we're going to come back and we're going to say we fail to reject. Not that there's nothing there, there's just not enough there. And that's what this idea of failing to reject the null hypothesis means. And we talk about evidence. We'll come back to that later in this video. What does that mean, right? How do we get the evidence, right? Because in a court case, it looks very different than the evidence in a statistical hypothesis test. And so we'll talk about what that evidence is. Right now, just kind of think of evidence in a court case if you want to use that as a placeholder. And then these last two bullet points that I want to have you fill in, go back to what we talked about in the last video, which was our decision about the alternative is solely based on what our decision on the null was. We make a decision about the null, and that leads us directly to a decision about the alternative. And so we're testing the null directly. We're either going to reject the null or we're going to fail to reject the null. That's what we've been talking about so far. And then what does that mean if we reject the null? That means that we conclude whatever the alternative is. And conversely, if we fail to reject the null, we cannot conclude the alternative. Those are one-to-ones. Nothing different ever happens. We never reject the null and do anything different. If we reject the null 100% of the time, we then conclude the alternative. If we fail to reject the null, we cannot conclude the alternative. Notice, no mention of a claim, right? We talked about that in that last video. We said the claim is just a means to an end, right? How do we get a null and alternative from the claim? We discard it because when we work through the problem, we don't use that claim ever again. It's solely about the null and the alternative. You're either going to A, reject the null, and that means you conclude the alternative, or B, you're going to fail to reject the null, and that means you cannot conclude the alternative. Again, we'll talk about how you know which decision to make on that as we move forward. And of course, just to wrap this up, like we've talked about, you then are either proclaimed guilty or not guilty, never proclaimed innocent. And so we've been talking about courtroom trials, and you probably already thought to yourself, rightfully so, that sometimes the jury gets things wrong. Sometimes the jury lets guilty people go free, and sometimes the jury puts innocent people in jail. And that's what we're going to talk about next with type 1 and type 2 errors, is that a statistical test works the same way. All the analogies, they all parallel exactly the same. We have two types of errors that we can make, and they're likened to a guilty person walking free and an innocent person being put in jail. More broadly to the point, we have to understand that there are 4 total options. And if you want to fast forward to the next page of your notes, we have a picture there outlining all 4 of those options. You have the possibility that the null hypothesis is true, and then you can reject or fail to reject. And then you have the idea that the null hypothesis is false, and you could reject or fail to reject. There's 4 options in that little 2x2 table. 2 of them lead you to a correct decision, 2 of them lead you to errors. So specifically, a type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true, and this occurs with probability alpha. And so that significance level that we talked about previously, that is what this is. So when we set a significance level for a statistical problem, we are saying that significance level is going to be the probability in which I make a type 1 error. Then you have a type 2 error, which is failing to reject the null hypothesis when it is false. And that occurs with probability beta. So 2 more Greek letters for us to know. Those are, again, probabilities, those Greek letters. Make sure we understand the difference there. Type 1 error and type 2 error are events. They are errors specifically. Alpha and beta are the probability that those errors occur. That's 2 different things. That's like saying I flipped a coin and I got heads. That's an event. The probability that I got heads, that's a number, right? Those are 2 different things. And the same thing here, that type 1, type 2 error are things, they're events, but then the probabilities that they occur with alpha and beta, those are numbers. They're probabilities. They're going to specifically fall between 0 and 1, depending on the problem. And the last idea is what we call the power of a test, which is a specific probability. So type 1, type 2 errors are things. The power is a probability. It's a probability 1 minus beta that we correctly reject a false null hypothesis. So I've walked through all this. You've written all this down, and there's a decent chance that you're a little bit confused right here because there's a lot of things happening. So now that we have it all on one page, I kind of want to talk it through and hopefully make sense of all of this. Notice when we talk about a type 1 error, we say rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true. Make sure we understand, of course, when we reject the null hypothesis and it's false, that's just a correct decision, right? So if I reject the null, if that's what I decide, I could either be right or wrong. That could either be the right call or the wrong call. If the null is false, I hope I would reject it. So if I reject the null and it's false, yay, good deal. But if I reject the null, but the null was actually true, that's a mistake. That's specifically a type 1 error. That's the opposite type of error of type 2, which is when the null is false and I wanted to reject it, but I didn't. I failed to reject it, right? Because if I fail to reject and the null is true, that's good. If the null actually is true, I want to fail to reject it. And then the power of a test is the probability that we correctly reject a false null. That's the idea that if the null is actually false, again, I want to reject it. Well, with what probability do I reject that null? And so we'll have a couple of examples here on the next slide. We'll loop back to this idea of a court case, and so hopefully kind of make that all make sense. But first, I want to cover something real quick that you might have thought to yourself, why do we have to have any kind of error? Why do we ever let a guilty person go free? And why do we ever charge innocent people with a crime? Whether it's, jail time or a fine, why do we ever do that? Right? Why can't we eliminate these errors? And that's a good question. Let's think about this though. Using that example, if I want to ensure that no innocent person is ever put in jail, if you want to stop and pause and think about it, I'd ask you think, how is the only way that we can ensure with 100% certainty, not 99.9, but 100% certainty that no innocent person ever gets put in jail? And I think if you stop and think about that, you'll kind of realize the answer is to never put anybody in jail. It's the only way to get that to happen. By putting anyone in jail, because as a jury member, again, you weren't there, you don't really know. The only way to say, I never am going to put an innocent person in jail, I'm never going to charge them with a crime, I'm never going to make them pay a fine or do community service, whatever it may be, the only way to avoid wrongly doing that is to never do it to anybody. And so you say, well, that's probably not a good idea. Let's go the other direction, though. Why do we ever let guilty people go free? They need to be punished for their crimes. They need to be fined or depending on the type of crime, put in jail, right? Say, how do we ensure that every person who ever commits a crime is punished appropriately? And I think you'll find the same answer if you think about this, that means we have to punish everybody, even those who didn't commit crimes. Because by letting anybody walk on a serious crime, then we risk the possibility that that person really did commit the crime. The only way to say everybody who commits the crime is going to be put in jail is to put everybody in jail. And that's not good either. All right. And so these type 1 and type 2 errors are just a way of life. They happen in our criminal justice system and they happen in statistical tests. What we want to do is we want to minimize these errors as much as possible, but we have to understand that you can't minimize them both. Alpha and beta are going to move in opposite tandem from each other. What I mean by that is that as one goes down, the other has to go up. Let's go back to our example. If we say, okay, we never want to put an innocent person in jail, we never want to make them do community service, whatever it may be. If we never do that, and you say, okay, well, we know we can't ever, but let's 99.9% of the time, let's really do it. Well, that means that by erring more on the side of, I don't want to make a mistake here, by putting someone who's innocent in jail, you are more likely to let someone go who really did commit a crime. That's going to make the type 2 error then increase. If you say, I want to be really making sure that guilty people are put in jail, and so I'm going to be really aggressive there, then you are going to decrease that type of error, but now you're going to increase the type of error that puts innocent people in jail, because by being overly aggressive, you're now catching too many people. So they move opposite of each other. Okay. So we've walked all over this. So let's look at this next example. Just kind of hammer it home. If we have this idea of the null is that someone is innocent, the alternative is someone is guilty, the type 1 error, we reject the null when that's the wrong decision. So a type 1 error in this case would be rejecting the null. Now notice I can say rejecting the null, and that is equivalent to concluding the alternative, right? Those are synonymous statements. So I can say a type 1 error is rejecting someone's innocence, or I could equivalently say that concluding someone's guilty. Those are synonymous statements, but that was the wrong thing to do. So I'm going to say concluding the man is guilty when he is really not. Now notice there are, again, a lot of different ways you can say that. Don't get caught up in the wording of this is the only one way to say it, because there's a lot of different ways I could have just typed this out. Okay, and I want you to make sure that you're not getting too caught in on these specific words and understanding the idea that says it's just rejecting the null, but that wasn't the right thing to do. Okay, rejecting the null, of course, means, we talked about, means concluding the alternative. Type 2 error, that's failing to reject the null when that was the wrong thing to do. So if you fail to reject the null, that means you don't conclude the alternative. So now it's not concluding the person is guilty, but that was the wrong thing to do, means he really was guilty. And then I think this example here for power really helps you understand why it's important and why we talk about it as a named term. Is the power is, again, the probability that we reject, and that was right. Rejecting the null means concluding the alternative. So in this case, that means that we concluded the person is guilty, and that was right. So the power is the probability that we were correctly able to conclude the man is guilty. So not only was he guilty, but we were correct in that. Notice in this example, there are two parts to all of these. If you only give one part, you are wrong. When we talk about type 1 error, type 2 error, and power of the test, there are two parts. It's what did you decide and were you right? Okay, so notice type 1 and type 2 errors are events, and so it's what did we do? We concluded or we didn't conclude, and that was either right or wrong. In type 1, type 2 error, it's wrong. Okay, and then power of the test, it's a probability that we both made a decision and that was the right decision, and specifically it's rejecting the null. So the probability that we rejected the null and that was the right thing to do. That's why I say correctly. So you can say the probability we concluded the man is guilty and he was. That's one way to say it. Or you could say the probability that we correctly concluded the man is guilty, because again, that's I've said both parts, right? I've said what we did, we concluded guilt, and I said we were right by adding the adjective correctly in there.